Welcome, everyone. Dr. Thor here. Get ready for Gnosis. Well, as most people who've been following me know, that I've made several different videos on Bruce Lee, his son, etc., because there is such an interest in him. And one of the problems is I'm not sure that he was the person that talked how much of a god he was, but everybody is over worshiping him and giving him a lot more credit than he deserves. On the other hand, this is certainly a person who should be recognized as a fantastic martial artist. And people misunderstand when I bring up certain issues that I'm somehow criticizing him. Well, it's not. He was the first one to get into mixed martial arts. Before that, you were not allowed. And I hope people understand that. That you had to get a note from your taekwondo teacher if you wanted to take another form of martial arts, like jiu-jitsu. So you weren't allowed to do it. These were kept very separate. He kind of broke that. He also broke the fact of teaching everyone kung fu, which was not allowed, by the way. You were only supposed to teach fellow Asians. So there's a lot that went on. There was an awful lot of racism, ironically, in his life by other Asians who hassled him and everything else. And this continued. And there's a lot of things that aren't talked about. Now, these letters that came out written to a Robert Bob Baker, who was an associate of his. He was in one of his films. They knew each other. He was I don't know if a direct student or indirect student of his school. And of course, like everybody in those times and even in today, there's a massive amount of, in Hollywood, of access to drugs because everybody's trying to be at a higher performance level, and so was he, apparently. So it's hard to say what the pedigree of these letters are. Apparently, so it is stated, and it's very hard to find out all the facts without spending days and days researching, but from the research that I did, apparently these letters talking about his use that Bruce Lee wrote came from or were surfaced now by Bob Baker's daughter. So, of course, that gives it more credibility. This would be certainly quite of a scam to create all these letters, but certainly it could be done. The writing is strange. His signature is different. I don't know what to say about any of this stuff. It appears that this is real. It makes sense. Is drug use something that is horrible? Well, it really isn't. And apparently, Polly's book, Polly, I believe Robert Polly's book, talked about and confirmed with many celebrities that he was a frequent marijuana user. And hash user. So this has pretty much been confirmed. So the whole idea is that, as the old cliche goes, when you open one door, other ones tend to bang open as well. He does seem to have had a great interest in LSD, which again was popular then, and of course cocaine, which wasn't quite that popular yet. But does this in any way condemn him? Well, I don't think it condemns him. Now it's a joke that if you're a big marijuana smoker, like so many Hollywood producers are, that it's kind of funny, and they're smoking dope all the time. Terrence McKenna smoked marijuana 24/7, and again, and so forth. Is that something that should be condemned? Well, people drink all the time as well. And now it's unfashionable to drink and fashionable to smoke. Now, everybody likes this stuff. Now, when it becomes excessive is when the problem is. Now, he was going through a very stressed time in his life. And in his life, he was making a new career. He was adjusting back into Hong Kong, where he grew up. And apparently had no contacts there. None of the people worked with him. He didn't want to get anything. It's kind of odd the way things are done here, but it certainly could be. You got to remember that also this is 50 years ago, and things were quite different. So apparently, as per these letters, is that he was constantly requesting large amounts of cocaine and other items to be sent to him and to be hidden clothing and other things. So this in itself is kind of shocking that this much was being transferred to him through the post, and he never really got into any problems. Nothing was grabbed, etc. And so it's kind of shocking. I don't know. I guess it was easier back then. They didn't have the sensors. Maybe they didn't have the dogs. You got to remember, this is early 1970s. Things are still kind of backwards in a lot of ways. So we assumed this system worked, and this was what's happening with his friend who was doing this all the time. And of course, after all, it is Bruce Lee asking you for this stuff. So you get into all these kind of problems that are endless in the nature of things to get things. To get into these kind of situations. But, it's also been documented that he had many mistresses and everything else. So this is not this virtuous great guy who wanted to come out as the very wisdom-based Chinese guy who spouted wisdom that he learned in Seattle and then taught Kung Fu as this kind of Kung Fu person, very similar to that series, is how he wanted to be taken. The problem is he's way ahead of his time, and I'm not sure all that stuff is all that popular anyway. Kung Fu only lasted, the TV series, for 3 years. After that, not much happened. We don't have any martial arts or philosophical TV shows on the air right now. There's been a few movies made. Most of these are very low budget. So we get back into this whole situation of what's going on. Does this, this shows, as I've been trying to tell people, that when you look at all these things, that this guy is a human and he is not something overly special. All of his martial arts ability, he looked wonderful on film because he was an actor. He came from an acting family. So we got to understand that. And that doesn't diminish the fact that he was a skilled martial artist. But the problem with him is he looked so good. And people idolize him as this Asian master all around the world. And one of the few, I guess, non-white people out there that you could idolize. So if you're from Sri Lanka or Venezuela or Brazil, well, this guy was more your type, so to speak. So there was a greater interest in him. And needless to say, I'm not a big fan of his films. I think they're very childish and very Hong Kong cinema. But there's no doubt that he looked cool and that this was part of it, and he was versed in how to do these things. But he knew nothing about camera work or anything else, and did all sorts of typical things that you do when you come from Hong Kong cinema. And that's why stuntmen didn't like him, because he tended to make contact, which is what they did in Hong Kong. A lot of people think it's because he was arrogant. He was doing what he thought made it look good. But that's not how camera work. But he didn't have any behind-the-camera skills all that much. So he was developing these slowly, but, I'm not sure how much of that he had or knew about. Not really when you get down to it. Certainly when he was in America, he was working like he was in Hong Kong. So what does that mean? The point is that all of us now understand that marijuana is kind of a joke drug. It certainly isn't the demon weed. It's legal on most places in the United States now, and medically legal almost everywhere in the United States. What's interesting is it's still not legal hardly anywhere else. And you have to also wonder why that we've always heard as Asia being this hotbed of drugs that he was unable to get them locally, even though he's a person who grew up there. I find that strange. But, of course, the world is strange. And this was a buddy of his who was known to be a drug supplier and was able to get everything, and he wrote letters to him that are very graphic of what he wanted and so forth. It seems to me that these are condemning items. That I guess he figures that if Baker got caught, he wouldn't get caught. I'm not sure how that works. So the point is that these are very explicit. I mean, there's no mis, ands, and buts here. So there's all sorts of problems involved with that. And what does these letters really mean? In fact, this just shows that he was very human. And he was helped by, yet again, and I hate to say it, but this racism card I'm a little bit sick of hearing. He was helped by a bunch of white people again, Baker being white, supplying him with drugs, if you call that being helpful. It was the Hollywood producers were helping him in Hong Kong, and they gave him jobs in Hollywood. Now, it's a tough area to be successful in. He was able to do it because he was this Asian guy, this mystical guy. Now, so the point is that Bruce Lee, who everybody apparently liked, and everyone's afraid to say anything negative about him in Hollywood, was basically a good guy, apparently. And I don't think that drug use means anything. Did this help his death? Well, I'm still convinced that this may have been part of the way that the triads murdered him. As far as I'm concerned, he was murdered there. Not because he was a pure guy, because he was unpure. There's all sorts of problems with going on here. Now we know that he was connected to drugs, which makes it even easier to take him out. But he was a big shot there, and other people control things in life. And if you're going to push your will into a very corrupt society, well, you're going to run into problems. So I'm not sure if this contributed to his death. I mean, it is thought by the letters here that he was consuming copious quantities of cocaine. Now, when you're under pressure, when you're pushing yourself, and of course there are pictures of him and when he was filming these that show how thin he is because he was taking so much cocaine. And means you barely can keep on any weight. So this was talk at the time. Thinking that this was just because of his schedule. But now we know a little bit better, and that apparently this wasn't just a little bit of pot and hash. This wasn't a few capsules of LSD. This was a fair amount of everything. And if you're going to push your body to the level that he did, you are going to put your body under great strain. Now, he collapsed before he died. I believe he collapsed a week before that and was taken to the hospital. This shows that he was having some sort of problems. Now, was this induced problems? And the medication that he was given before his death, did this push him over? Well, that was kind of a sedative and other things. But the point is that there were problems going on here, and we have to be very, very careful when we give somebody treatment. The problem is people have made him a god, and that in itself has forced me to make numerous videos talking about him and trying to clarify things. What was he? Well, he didn't compete in tournaments, so we don't know if he was good or not. Plain and simple. So I don't believe that he would have been a great fighter in competition. I do believe he could hold his own, but you got to remember, bigger people, and he admitted it himself, Joe Louis, a big, nasty guy, probably would have kicked his butt. The point is, does that mean he was a little weakling weasel? Well, of course not. Certainly, you don't want to go and challenge Bruce Lee. That certainly would be stupid to do that. So, certainly is a very interesting. Now, he broke open martial arts like nobody else did and should get credit for that. He shouldn't get credit that he's going to be the greatest fighter on the planet, and we shouldn't give him credit that he's this wise man. Now, a week or so ago, I got a comment on one of my videos stating that, I never saw Bruce Lee as a fighter. I saw him more as a person to learn from, a man of wisdom. Well, see, this is the problem which I don't like. And the point is, you can go into everybody's life who preaches anything and pick away things saying, well, you don't live the lifestyle you preach. And, of course, I think that's true with a lot of people. And, do what I say, not what I do, is part of it. But to somehow give him this great mantle of the super wise, physically fit, mentally balanced person just isn't true. So the whole idea is that he wasn't this meditative kung fu type guy. He was a typical guy, out of control, going through tough parts of his life and having major problems. Certainly, this kind of drug use, which now has been confirmed as best as we can, are these authentic? Are these real? They're on his stationery, which seems to be kind of strange to me that you would write such incriminating stuff on your own stationery. I don't trust anything, and I'm not entirely sure what these are, how they were fabricated or not. Were they watched carefully by handwriting experts? I mean, there's some really wild writing here. And as I said, I looked at his signature on several different of the pages that are online, and they're kind of very different. Now, some people do that in their signature. I tend to do it a little bit, but there doesn't seem to be even much of a coherency to it. His Bruce looks different in many areas. Did he write all this stuff? Was he stupid enough to be this blatant, this out in the open? Now, you got to remember in the late 60s, people didn't have the kind of phones that we have today. But that's not entirely true. Phone calls as well were expensive back then, but you could have made phone calls. Lee was known as a great writer. He wrote lots and lots of letters to a lot of people. He wrote several books for a guy who wasn't that popular or lived that long. So there's quite a bit of written material from him. And of course, I believe he did all this stuff so he could then sell these items to make money with it in the future, particularly his how-to books, etc. But what does this mean in the bigger picture? I don't know, and I'm not sure how real anything is. I hate to make statements confirming something that we're not. They seem to come from Baker's daughter. Well, that's a good start. She kept these for many years. Well, of course she did. Bruce Lee is a super celebrity and thought that she could probably sell these. Now, Bob Baker has been dead for over 30 years now. You think he would have come out sooner, but maybe she was hesitant to do this because of the problems and wanted to protect Lee's wife and so forth. Now it's 30 years later. None of this means anything anymore except for what Bruce is involved in. So the whole idea is this guy was not some sort of mystical Asian master. He was a guy who used drugs, had lots of affairs. He was a very average guy. And if you read about him in his different biographies, you'll find out that he didn't study Asian. He studied everything. He was big into positive thinking and Norman Vincent Peale. He didn't really find anything overly appealing about what we would call Asian mysticism, nor is that overly emphasized anywhere. So all of this is something that people should understand. Stop glorifying this guy like he's perfect. Let's highlight what he was good at. But, he didn't live long enough. He made a bunch of really junky films in Hong Kong that I don't really find very appealing. Certainly there's some interesting fight scenes. But, these aren't masterpieces of cinema. What did he do after that? Well, before that, he did some television stuff, and I guess you can give the Green Hornet whatever credit you want to give it. That was a character that was in the comic books, and it didn't go over well. Nobody watched the show. It was taken off the air in a year. So if everybody was so crazy about Lee and martial arts, well, they certainly didn't show it in the ratings. So all of this we have to understand, but this doesn't make him necessarily a bad guy. Just stop holding him up as this polished Buddha of perfection, when really he was just a common guy. He had some excellent martial arts skills. Now, where that goes and what that means, and got to remember the martial arts world basically is about a world of fighting. It's a macho sport of who's tougher than the other. And so he didn't go into competitions, and probably rightfully so. As I said, I'm not sure what that would have proved. If he won, everybody would say, well, you're showing off. If he lost, they would have said that he was just a big mouth. So I'm not sure that would have helped anybody. And, today, very few people in the martial arts world, at least the up-and-comers, have any kind of competition backgrounds. So the older stars did. Norris, Van Damme, these are people that had it. But, Seagal and other people were not in tournaments, even though apparently he, like so many others, were highly trained and by masters. So, but, they're not competition people, and I'm not sure that necessarily is a big statement anyway. Competition is not real fighting, even though they tried to mimic that. That's what Joe Louis did with full contact karate that he started because he didn't like the point stuff. So All of that is dead. So I don't think this in any way does it. I don't know. People should now criticize him for stuff like this. Obviously, he's going through a stressed time in his life. He was taking a lot of drugs, and this probably contributed to his death. I still think it's a dark and murky story. We know from Jackie Chan that he has been constantly harassed by the triads. I frankly doubt that Bruce Lee escaped this. He was going to be making a lot of money. Things don't look good in that area. And it's very easy to just jump in there and say, well, he died from drug abuse. I'm not sure that's true. He also didn't talk about having back pain, which you think you'd be taking drugs for, which has been talked. But there's a lot of confusion there as well. And there's a lot of confusion in a whole bunch of things. When you read a bunch of information on him and look at interviews from him and his wife, well, there's the information they're stating has been contradicted by others. So what are we to make of it? His grandfather supposedly was a Dutch Jew, supposedly, yet his family stated that he was a German. Now, that may have been said because he was a Dutch Jew, and people were not looking to be connected to that. It was just one of many things that were misstated and thought of in the family. So what does that mean? So we just don't know with all of it. It's really unfortunate with all of it. It would have been interesting, him coming back to the United States and leading a martial arts great revival or starting, and see where that would have went, because everybody liked him. He certainly looked cool. Now, if he was in front of good Hollywood type directors, I think there would have been a very interesting films that could have been made that would have been probably martial arts masterpieces. But you got to remember, it was hard to get anything produced in Hollywood, period, no matter whom or what you are. And I think people are naive to think if you're some master of something that you're going to be given millions of dollars. It's very, very difficult. And it's unlikely that Bruce would have been successful, unfortunately, when he came back here, period. That just was not popular yet. This was not what people were watching. And of course, there was the international audiences, which maybe would have carried him and carried a lot of B actors and other people as well out there who used their name, like Robert Mitchum's son. And we go on with a bunch of people that use the names of their fathers. So this is all part of the Hollywood process that I'm not sure anybody understands very well. So while is this surprising? Well, we all knew, and I've stated this before, that he was found with certain drugs in his system. Now, apparently he wasn't found with cocaine or these other things in his system, or they didn't check for it. He was found supposedly, and I don't believe anything coming from the coroner either, but everybody smoked marijuana from that period on, and that kept going all the way up to today. The reason why marijuana is legal now and used medically is because everybody used it anyway. So that certainly isn't a condemning of him. The use of large amounts of cocaine certainly is. And again, a lot of people used LSD and other things frequently, and apparently he was into experimenting with these things because it's a quick, easy way to function or get new ideas in life, and that's why artists have always been using drugs. Usually it was lots of alcohol, but there's certainly plenty other ones. It was thought that Notre Dame used to sniff nutmeg, which is a slight hallucinogen, before doing his prophecies. So there's nothing new here, people. I don't think that people should give this a great deal of credit. Look at his greater work and make your own decisions. But if you're going to go out and scream somebody's perfect and wonderful, well, you're just looking for ridicule. Until next time.